Welcome to our webinar focused on opportunities to enhance climate action in the power sector. We know many of you probably are logging in from home and to stay safe from the coronavirus, and we do appreciate your willingness to spend some time with us to talk about pathways and solutions in the power sector for climate action. Today's speakers include Naomi Leprince-Ringway. She's an associate in the Global Climate Program here at WRI. She works towards ensuring the enhancement of climate ambition in a wide range of countries. Prior to joining WRI, she worked in India on climate and energy at the Energy and Resources Institute and with the IPCC. Next slide, please. She will give an overview of a new WRI publication, Opportunities to Enhance NDC in the Power Sector. Brent Wenner is a senior energy analyst at the International Energy Agency and lead of power sector modeling for the World Energy Outlook. He has contributed to the past 9 editions of the World Energy Outlook. Most recently, he was coordinator and lead author of the Offshore Wind Outlook 2019 and WEO 2018 Special Focus on Electricity. Prior to joining the IEA, Brent was an economist at the US Department of Energy. He'll be highlighting IEA's most recent scenario analysis and solutions and options for NDCs to push the power sector forward. Ron Benioff is an international program manager at National Renewable Energy Laboratory and executive director of the LEDS Global Partnership. He will be sharing examples from Mexico, Vietnam, and some of the other 100 countries that are part of the LEDS GP network, as well as findings from their report, Pathways to Low Carbon Transport. Next slide, please. During this webinar, attendees will be on mute. You can ask questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The speakers will be seeing your questions and will answer them online and at the end of the presentations. This recording will be emailed to you and available to watch within 24 hours. Naomi, over to you.
Thank you, Beth, and hi everyone. Thank you for connecting today to our webinar on opportunities to enhance NDCs in the power sector. Very briefly, to give a little bit of background, WRI and UNDP together have, along with other partners, been developing a series of guidances on enhancing NDCs. We launched our first overarching guide on how to enhance NDCs in September during Climate Week last year. And then during COP25, we launched several sector-specific guidance documents on different sectors. We have one on power, we have one on transport, one on agriculture, and one on forestry. And we have a few other sectors and themes to come. So today's webinar and my presentation will focus on the guidance in the power sector document, which is designed hand in hand with the overarching guidance that we have on enhancing NDCs. Because basically follows the similar processes and steps. So next slide, please. Firstly, I'll just spend a minute clarifying what we mean when we say NDC enhancement so that we're all on the same page. As you know, NDC documents are all very diverse. They cover a wide range of issues in different sectors. And so when WRI first started working on what revising or updating or enhancing the NDCs could mean, we decided to break it down to all the different ways in which it might be possible to revise or enhance an NDC. And so we came up with 4 different categories. First, we have enhancing mitigation ambition. In the context of this guidance, this means that under the enhanced NDC, if it's fully implemented, the overall cumulative greenhouse gas emissions would be lower than they would have been under the fully implemented initial NDC. Then we have a separate category for implementation, and this is where countries can include elements in their revised NDC that basically just make it easier to achieve the level of ambition that they had already set out in the initial NDC. Then we have an adaptation category, which the vast majority of countries have actually already included in their NDCs, and this is of particular importance, especially to developing countries. And so adaptation, of course, is also an area in where enhancement of the NDC can happen. And then finally, we have what we call communication, or CTU, clarity, transparency, and understanding, where countries can provide more clarity and additional information, for example, on the scope of a greenhouse gas target, what is the baseline, etc. So I'll just clarify that the scope of our power sector guidance focuses primarily on mitigation ambition, although we do acknowledge that in many cases there are synergies where action in the power sector can have both mitigation and adaptation outcomes, but we have not tried to be fully comprehensive in this document on all the different ways in which the power sector will need to adapt to transitions, although of course we acknowledge and recognize that it is a very important consideration. Next slide, please. So on this slide, what you'll see on the x-axis is the total number of NDCs that explicitly mention types of targets or policies and measures that are related to power. The main takeaway from this slide is that in their initial NDCs, many countries have actually included different power-related targets, policies, or measures. This doesn't mean, however, that they have tapped the full range of solutions that are available and that are necessary to enable the fundamental shifts that are required of the power grid in order for it to decarbonize. So you'll see that the most common target is one for renewable energy as a share of the power mix. That is followed closely by targets for renewable energy installed capacity, and then investment commitments for renewable power. And then if you look at the policies and the measures, which you'll see in the yellow bars on this slide, well, basically most of them are focused on growing solar energy and on improvements in power generation efficiency. Next slide. Okay, so this slide shows some of the key opportunities we found when we were pulling this guidance document together. Now, this is not a comprehensive list of all the different ways you could address power in your NDC, but what we've tried to do here is reflect, firstly, what we saw could be gaps in the existing NDCs, and secondly, what has changed since the 2015 timeframe when countries were developing the first set of NDCs, and now, when there have been tremendous advances, particularly in technology and costs in the power sector, but also in terms of policies and best practices, and with solutions that are available today, which may have seemed improbable even just 5 years ago. So a few areas in which I'd like to go into a little bit. Well, firstly, the cost of renewable energy, as everyone knows, is plummeting. And as the costs continue to fall, renewable energy has started to become cost competitive with coal and sometimes even cheaper in some geographies. Secondly, in most credible 1.5 scenarios, the power sector is assumed to be virtually decarbonized by 2050. And if this is the case, it means that clean electrification of end-use sectors becomes possible. And so scenarios see electricity's share of the final energy demand growing from roughly less than a fifth to nearly half in 2050. This combination of a decarbonized power sector and electrification of end-use sectors has great potential and can deliver substantial amounts of the required energy-related CO2 emission reductions. Thirdly, we have new business models that were once pilots. They were pilot projects, and now they're being scaled with the involvement of the private sector to promote renewable energy deployment or energy efficiency or energy access, but also they generate local revenue. They can help, and all of them can help improve the power system's capacity to absorb increased renewable energy. Then we have storage technologies, which are essential for a reliable grid, for a reliable decarbonized grid. And these technologies today are showing huge deployment and cost reduction potential. And then finally, we have opportunities coming from digitalization of the grid. I think it's fair to say that the 21st century grid will be digital, because as variable renewable energy increasingly integrates the grid, while managing the grid so that supply always matches demand, will not be done manually, it'll be done through digital technologies. And so we are moving towards smart grids, and developments in this area of digitalization is unlocking opportunities in the power sector. For the power sector, digitalization is also a key amplifier of power system transformations because it enables and creates new intersections between the power sector and the end-use sectors like transport, buildings, industry, etc. So all of these developments and all this progress are important in the NDC enhancement process to reflect these opportunities and the changing cost structures that we're facing now. Otherwise, the revised NDCs would be based on outdated information. So what our report finds is that those new opportunities that are emerging in the power sector are in fact moving the needle in terms of where ambition needs to be in the power sector today. So what I mean by this is that 5 years ago, efforts needed to be channeled towards making renewable energy cost competitive with coal. And it's fair to say today that this transition is now in full swing. And so enhancing ambition in the power sector can be, not always, but can be but it is not always just as easy as enhancing renewable energy targets anymore. Our report finds that ambition in the power sector today needs to support the implementation of 4 foundational elements in order to ensure that the potential of power transitions is now tapped. So the first element is that NDCs now need to focus on enhancing grid flexibility. This is because a reliable power grid requires supply and demand of electricity to balance each other smoothly and in real time. And the increasing amount of reliable renewable energy in the grid requires more flexible power systems to enable that. And without added flexibility to power grids, transitions toward accelerated renewable energy could be slowed or could be stalled. Secondly, NDCs need to address strategies for addressing existing coal assets, because many economies today are still dependent on coal, and policymakers need to plan to address coal in their decarbonization pathways to ensure that transitions in the power sectors happen with the least disruption possible. Thirdly, NDCs need to address making sure that institutions and power markets are robust enough and mature enough to facilitate those power transitions, because in fact today in most countries we could argue that institutional changes are more important than technology improvements to achieve full-scale decarbonization of the power sector. And this will require changing institutions, changing markets and infrastructure through better policies and through greater coordination. And lastly, it'll be important that NDCs look at ensuring that cross-sectoral opportunities are planned for between the power sector and electrification of end-use sectors, because assuming that the power sector is decarbonized by 2050, as is the case in most 1.5 scenarios, while finding synergies between the power sector and energy efficiency and electrification of end-use sectors is what will enable closing this decarbonization gap. So of course, all of this is going to be highly country specific and context specific. So this is not at all meant to be prescriptive in any way, but rather what we're trying to do here is just highlight and maybe provide a bit of inspiration about where we think countries might want to look as they undergo the process of revising and enhancing their NDCs. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we have some options for how all these elements and these opportunities that I was talking about in the previous slide can be reflected as enhancement in NDCs. So of course, those are not mutually exclusive, and countries could do any of these or all of these. So I'll start with the top right. This is about integrating additional power action into an economy-wide target, ideally making that target more ambitious. And then going down, you could also develop a greenhouse gas target specific to the power sector. You could also add specific policies and measures for power. And then if we move to the left, we have various sector-specific targets for power that could be appropriate to include in an NDC, and which are framed around something other than greenhouse gas emissions. And so just to cite a few, but this could take the form of a renewable energy target as a share of total electricity generation mix. It could be strengthening or adding targets to support grid flexibility. It could be energy storage targets to support renewable energy deployment. It could also be strengthening or adding targets and commitments to address existing fossil fuel assets. So for example, a coal phase out target for the power sector coupled with a just transition plan, or commitments to no new added coal capacity after current project pipeline, or for example, air quality targets related to the power sector. So I'll stop here. Thank you. This concludes my presentation. And the next slide, you'll see the link where you can find the power guidance as well as all of our other NDC enhancement documents. And I will now pass the floor on to Brent Wanner from the IEA for his presentation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Naomi. And thank you very much for having me today participate in this webinar in these changing times, everything moving digital format. So I'm very happy to be a part, joining you from Paris today. I would just like to take a few minutes and quantify a bit the challenge, the scale of the challenge, and highlight some of the measures needed through the scenario work of the World Energy Outlook 2019. I think everyone can see. To highlight, so first, a word about the scenarios. I think that's quite important to understand. The World Energy Outlook we think of as providing key information to policymakers worldwide, relatively to give them a sense of the path that current policies and measures and those stated policies, where they lead us, looking out over the next 20 to 30 years, versus the track that we have globally committed to address climate change. So we think of, I'll highlight two particular scenarios. We talk about the stated policy scenario, which is more or less the track that we are on. Of course, involves a lot of technological advance and changes, but also the policies and ambitions that are expressed through the nationally determined contributions, but also national policies. And then on the other hand, the sustainable development scenario, a scenario we developed that focuses on addressing climate change while also providing full access to energy for all worldwide by 2030 and addressing clean air, addressing pollution issues. So if we look at the power sector, of course, I'll focus on the power sector here as well. Through the stated policy scenario, we see the trajectory for coal capacity changing quite dramatically. We've actually, over the last 20 years, it's been increasing very rapidly. And in fact, the total amount of coal-fired generation over the last 20 years has doubled worldwide. But this is a changing path. We're seeing fewer investment decisions for new coal plants happening. There is still a very large pipeline of nearly 700 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants that are either under construction or planned worldwide. And this would largely be offset by the aging fleets in advanced economies, particularly in Europe and the United States, being retired at the end of their natural lifetime, giving you a plateauing of coal capacity, which would be the first time over a prolonged period in history, but obviously far from what we need to accomplish. Without saying too much, we see other changes, gas-fired capacity coming in mainly for flexibility, nuclear, hydro capacity remaining under current policies, but the big growth stories are around wind and solar PV. And with this, what I wanted the key takeaway is that we see actually most of demand growth being met by new renewable capacity worldwide, 75% of all electricity demand growth to 2040, which is very good news. This, of course, raises the share of low carbon in the global power mix. However, it doesn't actually stop emissions or it doesn't cause a decline in CO2 emissions, which is ultimately what we need. And so that gives you a sense we not only need to meet new demand, but we also need to deal with the legacy issues. And that's what I'll focus on here. I wanted to highlight that this is happening around the world. Renewables are the main new construction activity in the power sector worldwide. This shows over the next 20 years what percentage of new capacity coming online is set to be renewables under stated policy. So it's under the NDCs, under nationally determined contributions and national policies. And we see that being the vast majority in markets around the world. So this is very good news. However, this, as I mentioned, only flattens out overall power sector CO2 emissions. What we need in a sustainable development scenario is another push. We need everyone to be 80% or thereabout of new capacity being built. And that's largely because of the pipelines. Once the under construction plants are finished, we need for there to be a clear focus on low carbon capacity, low carbon resources only. And with that, we see quite a changing power system. I'd highlight that this will mean a new operation for the power system. And we work in the agency to quantify that specifically on an hourly basis, doing hourly modeling, looking at the flexibility required in systems and how this will change the face of electricity security. So here I just want to highlight that we're used to historically changes in electricity demand in the neighborhood of 10 to 20%, even from 1 hour to the next. In the European Union, for example, this was a 1 hour to the next during the World Cup in 2018. In India, this was actually during a cricket match. We also see reductions where wind and solar PV production step up from 1 hour to the next, and the system must come down. If we plot every hour across major markets, each dot here represents the hour-to-hour change. You see kind of what's a normal amount of flexibility we're used to today. And then even in the stated policy scenario, what kind of flexibility we're talking about by 2040. And in most cases, this is at least double. In some cases, as in India, this is actually 5 or 6 times as much flexibility as you have today. And of course, at the same time, the usual source of flexibility of power plants are in decline. So we will need networks to step up, as mentioned, smart networks, digital networks need to be scaled up, but also demand side response and energy storage have a huge role to play here. And then if we come back to the key topic here of dealing with the legacy emissions from coal-fired power plants, to give a sense of the scale, we're well over 2,000 gigawatts under operation today. And if you consider also those under construction, you have 2,250 gigawatts worldwide. 40% of those are low efficiency subcritical plants. And if we think about where many of these plants are, actually 2/3 of coal-fired capacities in developing economies in Asia, and those are on average 12 years old. So this is not an issue of an aging fleet that will naturally go away very quickly. In fact, we quantified, given standard lifetimes, often on the scale of 40 to 50 years, how long and how much will these plants continue to emit, just those that are in operation today or under construction. We see today they're 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, 1/3 of global CO2 emissions, not just from the power sector, that's out of the total energy-related energy-related emissions. And that does decline. Obviously, we have some plants that are aging and are coming offline and operating less, but we're still talking about 6 gigatons of emissions even by 2050. And what path that needs to actually take is a much more severe, faster decline, getting to 0 before 2050, a 60% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. And we think that will take a multi-pronged approach, focusing not only on retrofitting plants with carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, but also repurposing plants, focusing more on flexibility rather than the outright bulk energy production. And we'll also need some early retirements to help reduce, to accelerate those emission reductions. So this is the scale of the challenge we're talking about. Something that will be slow and progressive needs to be happening much, much faster. And through the upscaling the national determined contributions, this can certainly be done. And ultimately, when we're talking about the scenarios and all of the measures, there are many. One, we have the current trends. Already the stated policies help reduce global energy-related CO2 emissions, but they maintain more or less a flat path. And that obviously needs to be quite different on a sustainable development scenario pathway, where we see reductions down to about 10 gigatons by 2050, really a 40% reduction by 2030. And that's going to take efforts along renewable energy, energy efficiency, and other fuel switching. And that can look like, okay, we have 3 measures, but in fact, that requires a host of many measures to accomplish this. Renewable energy should be at the forefront of those efforts, but we also need energy efficiency to really, in many sectors, and to play a big role, to be really the first fuel. And so that is in industry, in buildings, in transport. We need all of these to take a step forward in order to accomplish moving towards a 1.5 degree stabilization pathway. And if I bring it to kind of the immediate talk of the day, obviously we are all concerned about the current situation and the changes in lifestyle And there's a lot of discussion going on within governments now of what can be done in the short term to stimulate economies. And as the IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, recently said in a commentary, we need to put clean energy at the heart of stimulus plans worldwide. And we are doing work to make sure that this happens. If we look at the amount of investment that would be needed or where we've been sitting in 2018, you have the left bars, how much has been invested. We're talking about just over $300 billion in renewables, significantly less or about the same actually in grids and battery storage. And we need those to be scaled up substantially. This, of course, the current situation is challenging, but there is an opportunity to have a twin benefit of accelerating and stimulating economic activity, and two, accelerating the clean energy transitions by having part of that funding be put towards supporting clean energy development, rapid upscaling of renewables in particular. There's an advantage for renewables that they can be built very quickly. Many projects can be built within 1 year from the time that they've been permitted and approved. And there is a pipeline of projects ready and available. And so this is somewhere where the economic activity can be very quick to respond to these incentives. And again, it needs to also focus on energy efficiency measures, not only the technologies that are here right now, but also putting money towards research and development on hydrogen, perhaps advanced battery designs. And of course, we can't forget what needs to be done on the grids and network side. And so ultimately, there is a window of opportunity here with many considering how to best stimulate growth. And of course, then we know this also has a wide impact on the type of jobs, from very technical jobs, research and development jobs, to implementation and construction. And so it would also stimulate a wide part of the economies worldwide. And ultimately, governments, from our own assessments, are contributing or are a part of the decisions for up to 70% of total energy investment worldwide. And so this is a real opportunity because of the usual involvement of governments to steer investment. It's a natural opportunity then to scale that up and achieve two goals or move towards achieving two goals at the same time. And with that, I thank you very much and look forward to the questions and discussion.
Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you during this webinar, and I greatly appreciate your taking the time and WRI organizing this webinar. It's so important that in these challenging times and the continuing both health and climate emergency that we're facing, that we're continuing to work together and support each other. And so I'm happy to share with you some of the work that the National Renewable Energy Lab and the LEDS Global Partnership are doing to assist countries in transforming their power systems towards resilient, low carbon pathways in support of NDCs and in support of longer term strategies. I'll offer a couple examples of the work that we're doing in individual countries. Then I'll talk about some regional and global activities that we've been undertaking and resources and that provide opportunities for deeper collaboration across countries. So first wanted to highlight some of our work in Mexico. We've had the pleasure of working at the national and state level in Mexico for over 15 years. This is through a variety of programs, the 21st Century Power Partnership, the North American Renewable Integration Study looking across Canada, US, Mexico, support through the NDC partnership and the government of Mexico through the Climate Action Enhancement Package, and a number of other programs, including collaboration with C40 and something called the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. This work has very much had very strong engagement from SEMERNOT at the national level, as well as climate officials at the state level. In Yucatan and Jalisco, the governor of Jalisco's heads the governor's climate task force in Mexico, and one of the leaders of some of the state level work. Our support to Mexico has looked at supporting the energy reform process, modeling to support long-range planning, technical assistance on renewable integration practices, design of renewable energy auctions, as well as strategies for mobilizing private investment. Some of the things that we're kind of actively working on right now, working with the state of Yucatan on a roadmap for decarbonization of their energy system and improving reliability, working with the energy ministries and regulators and the system operator, SENACE, on capacity building, on power system modeling, but also planning and best practices with integration of renewables into the system, and supporting kind of market analysis to look at regulatory form and market structures. We're also working on programs for clean energy support to local governments and private sector. We're working on aggregating, working with industrial associations in Mexico on how corporations, local corporations and multinationals can aggregate demand and procurement for clean energy. And we found in a number of countries, a similar work in Colombia and Vietnam, and Philippines, that we found that by aggregating demand from corporate purchasers and major manufacturers, they can both reduce the cost and get better deals in terms of purchasing energy, but also can be a big driver in scaling up deployment and attracting investment and supporting policy change for more efficient market mechanisms. That's a big part of our work. We're also working in Mexico, and this is at the request of SEMERNOT, and support their NDC priority for electrification of vulnerable communities, looking at a range of rural energy solutions for both the power and the transport sector, and then have some work on distributed generation pilot programs across the states in Mexico. We have a similarly robust portfolio of support in Vietnam, looking again both at power system planning and operations and at mobilizing private investment. Our primary partner in Vietnam is the Ministry of Industry and Trade and their energy efficiency and renewable energy unit. And they're the kind of key advisors to the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Planning and Investment on the energy sector targets for Vietnam's NDCs and their longer term climate strategies. And we also work with MPI and Ministry of Environment. Our power sector work in Vietnam, so we've been supporting the power system, power sector plans, the 8th development plan in Vietnam, working not only with MOIT, but also the energy regulator and the Institute of Energy, their kind of leading technical institute, along with EVN, the national utility, on strengthening grid modeling and renewable energy scenarios and access to data for scaling up renewables to be part of their latest development plan, and then to feed into consideration for future NDC targets. We're creating a production cost model that's appropriate for the Vietnamese system. We have a grid modeling working group and a deep training program for the government, for the technical institutes, EVN, the utility, on grid modeling and application and development of scenarios for their future plan. And then similar to Mexico, we're also working on the private sector investment side through this Clean Energy Investment Accelerator program, which is a partnership between NREL, WRI, and Allotrope Partners, which is an investment firm. And In Vietnam, we've been looking, especially working with apparel manufacturers, which are a big part of the GDP, both international apparel manufacturers and the local suppliers in Vietnam, to work on aggregating demand, to help design major retrofits of industrial parks with solar and with wind, and in collaboration with USAID and others to work on some market changes, such as allowing for direct power purchase agreements so that corporations can directly purchase renewable energy in the system, and to work on enhanced wheeling and banking. And that's been a very powerful effort, and it's helping support policy change in Vietnam, and is a nice complement to the technical work on modeling and grid integration. So those are a couple examples of our country level work, and we're happy to learn about, if there's folks on the phone from other governments, happy to learn about opportunities to partner with additional countries. I wanted to highlight now a couple resources that we have and activities at the global and regional levels. NREL and the LEDS Global Partnership recently partnered with colleagues from Germany, from India, from Colombia, and other countries on a study of pathways for power system transformation to achieve low carbon, low cost, and high resilience and security objectives. And this report is available at NREL. You can see the link below. What we've done here is developed a system for walking through, or a framework for walking through, given different objectives that countries may have for their power system, and different factors, obviously resource and land availability, your economic industry, your grid characteristics, the power vulnerability, plus consideration of trends and innovation. How can that inform your selection of pathways? And we've focused on 4 different pathways that I think that are really are going to drive structures in the future. And ultimately for countries and jurisdictions, this is at the state and provincial level as well, the ultimate solution is really a mix of these. But what's the right mix of a focus on a distributed energy system that say in the northeast of the US is sort of the primary pathway where states in that region are headed. What investment is needed and the scale of change needed to better link transmission and distribution systems. And I think across countries and power systems, we're seeing the importance of much more interactivity between the bulk power transmission and the demand side and distributed generation. And what's the scale of investment in cleaning bulk power systems, shifting, as Brent talked about, from large scale coal to renewables, along with gas and other technologies. And across all 3 of these, we're really seeing a change in market dynamics, where transactions will be managed through blockchain, through direct consumer interaction with suppliers, and what's the right mix of these pathways. You'll see to the right on this slide some expert analysis done by the team that looks at, what are the disruptive technologies, which ones are likely to have the biggest impact over what time that we need to pay attention to. So blockchain, a very low cost storage, integration of electrification of vehicles and grid services from vehicles and through electrification, very low cost PV, low cost microgrid controllers, and EV charging are some of the more disruptive technologies that we see coming forward, and that all of us involved in power system planning and operations need to pay attention to. This is an example from that report of one of the pathways that we've developed. Just wanted to highlight examples that show to embark on kind of a revolution towards distributed energy generation and demand management. We've outlined with this group of experts the set of actions needed over time, starting with things like interconnection and moving to market data and then market products for monetizing DER services, along with a whole set of other actions on rules and planning techniques and retirement of assets, and shows you kind of the transition from a traditional bulk power system to one that's dominated by distributed generation and storage and demand management, along with complementary changes in cleaning, moving from a traditional higher carbon power system to a low carbon power system. Now, a few other, in addition to kind of that work at the global level, the LEDS Global Partnership, and NREL supports the LEDS Global Partnership. The Secretariat is managed by GIZ, the German Technical Assistance Agency. Through the LEDS Global Partnership, we have a series of regional programs that work with countries to promote learning and technical assistance. So in Asia, we have our GRID Renewable Energy Community of Practice. This brings together governments, regulators, utilities, system operators, technical institutes to learn from each other, to access technical assistance, to collaborate on products and reports. We're right now focusing on two topics: on energy storage. We've had a series of events and exchanges and advisory support, an upcoming webinar. We're also doing more work with countries on sharing tools and providing assistance on pathways for transforming power systems. So some of the pathways that I talked about from that report. And we have technical assistance available to countries, so please join that effort, and that assistance is available in other regions as well. And a large number of countries that are part of this community of practice and participating in knowledge sharing. Have a similar community in Africa, more focused on mini grids, which has been the priority of African countries, to look at design of clean mini grids powered by renewable energy with complementary investments in energy efficiency and storage systems. Our work in Africa has a large number of participating countries who are leading this initiative. It's bottom-up, driven by the priorities of these countries. We focused a lot on design of mini grid standards and technical assistance, on financing and business models, and on pilot programs. Going forward, we have a set of remote meetings planned on how to link pathways and ambition for mini grids with NDCs, on de-risking strategies that will help attract investment, and how to work with the finance community. And now we're launching a new round of learning activities and technical assistance on developing transformative visions across both mini grids and bulk power systems for African countries to develop longer-term integrated strategies for a transition to low carbon energy solutions. And would be glad to, please let me know or contact the Africa-led Secretariat with the address there below if you'd like to participate in those activities. I'll note we also have similar work in Latin America. We're supporting the Renewable Energy Latin America initiative that's setting ambitious goals for renewable energy deployment, providing support with analysis and technical assistance on goals and pathways for Latin American countries. And finally, I wanted to mention a really exciting new consortium that NREL is launching with a large number of partners, ACE, America, CSIR in South Africa, IEEE, ESIG, Fraunhofer in Germany, Imperial College, EPRI, and CEOs of system operators around the world. And this is a global power system transformation consortium. The focus here is the recognition that it's the power system operators that are so critical in having the capacity and ability to implement solutions to manage high amounts of variable renewable energy on their grid. And there's a number of system operators, EnergyNet in the UK, in Denmark, excuse me, the UK grid operator, California and Texas, in the US, the Australian grid operator, that have tremendous experience now in managing very high amounts of renewable energy on the grid. And we need to share that knowledge, help adapt solutions in developing countries, and work on workforce development. So through this consortium, we'll be providing support to system operators in developing countries on the advanced engineering and control solutions. We'll also be working with local universities on training programs for graduates and for continuing professional education, working on technology standards testing and certification, and expanding access to open data and tools for all system operators and regulators and planners, leading towards very ambitious goals. Together with others, we hope achieve a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions for power systems around the world, as well as dramatically scaling up investment in advanced power solutions. Very happy to have others join in this effort and access. This will be both deep technical assistance to countries and advisory support, learning and exchange programs between system operators. So please let me know if you're interested in this program, and my contact information is here, along with the website for NREL and the LEDS Global Partnership. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. We're going to move to Q&A now. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. You could probably find that under more if you don't see it at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to probably go a few minutes after the hour just to make sure we answer all the questions. The first questions I thought we could start with Brent. Can you address the question about if we have 2,500 gigawatts from coal in 2040, is that too much to meet mid-century strategies? Also, is nuclear investment, and a question from Amin, nuclear investment would be more in the SDS 2025-30. Isn't that a contradiction to sustainable?
Sure, thanks, and thanks very much for the questions. I think that on the first point on the coal capacity in 2040, absolutely, 2,500 gigawatts of coal worldwide would be too much to ultimately meet our overall sustainable development goals. And that is the point, that we are on a path that is inconsistent with our longer term mid-century strategies and overall objectives. The implementation measures to get there have not yet been put in place. And so this is actually the kind of the heart of our work, is identifying the difference between where we are headed and where we need to go. So very much so, the amount of operating unabated coal-fired capacity needs to be reduced quite dramatically. So as shown in a later slide of mine, that we see unabated coal-fired generation needing to go to zero before 2050. And there is an important distinction between capacity and generation. Because a coal plant is there and operational, if you operate it a lot less, of course, the emissions are also reduced substantially. So there is a transition phase where we may have a lot of coal capacity that is operating less, but we can still reduce the emissions while maintaining electricity security. To the second question on nuclear investment, I would highlight that this is a key facet of the overall objective, is that we will need all sources of low carbon electricity to get where we are going. Today, nuclear power is the second largest source of low carbon generation worldwide, behind only hydropower. In advanced economies, nuclear power is actually the largest low carbon source of electricity today. And so its continued operations and its overall pathway are critical to achieving our decarbonization goals. And most of what this increased investment that was shown in the figure is actually about extending the life of existing nuclear power plants, making the appropriate investment in to continue safe operations of these power plants in countries that are interested in continuing nuclear power within their overall power mix. We ultimately see nuclear power as part of a cost-effective mix, much less about new construction, but much more about making the best use of the large nuclear fleets that are in existence today, but that are aging, that are reaching the end of their original design lifetimes, original operational original lifetimes. And so there would be investments needed to continue those operations safely. Thank you.
Thanks, Brent. One more question for you. What percentage of energy investment, this was to clarify what you had spoken about before, what percentage of energy investment did you just say came from central governments? Was that 80%? And then after you clarify that question, we'll go to Arika's question for Naomi. Why does India's energy demand projection require so much flexibility compared to the EU, US, and China?
Sure. Yes. So to this, right. Sorry, I cut out for a second there. Sorry, Mary, I had missed, it cut out just for a second, so I missed some of the question there for me.
Yeah, if you could just clarify what percentage of energy investment
Right.
from central governments?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. So we've done an assessment of overall across the energy landscape, how much is directly tied to central governments, either their direct investments, so they are actually the ones paying the bills and making the direct investment decision, or setting up the policies that enable the investment. And so the policy landscape, like take auction-based systems for renewables, where the amount is clearly determined by a central government. And overall, that's 70%, in fact, a little bit more than 70% of all energy investment. And it's actually a higher percentage of that in electricity, because networks, both distribution and transmission, are in most places regulated. And so in effect, they are through government regulation, often for reliability standards. As I mentioned, for renewables, much of this investment, if not all, is actually through regulated decision-making rather than decisions based purely on market-based rules. So there, of course, there are very large and many private companies who are actively engaged in this investment, but ultimately they are following the cues and the direction set by our overall climate ambitions and overall national level targets.
Over to you, Naomi.
Oh, yeah, sure. So on the question on why India's grid requires so much flexibility as compared to perhaps other places, basically, I think flexibility requirements depend on many things, but including on your demand projections and on your supply scenarios. And those are different in different localities and different contexts in different countries. And those depend on, for example, how electrified a country already is. It depends on the energy mixes for electricity production. It depends on contexts, which include, for example, a country's climate and the need that a country may have for heating or cooling, for example. And it can depend on the kind of infrastructure that's already in place in the markets, the electricity markets that are already developed and in place. And so these vary substantially in different countries. In India, the electricity demand is only set to increase as India powers its development. And so the grid capacity for including renewable energy has to be enhanced in view of that. So the requirement for flexibility isn't just a function of renewables, but they do increase the need for it because of their variable nature and their non-dispatchable nature. And India, as you know, has very huge renewable energy targets. It's 450 gigawatts by 2050. So adding so much capacity to its grid will require enhanced flexibility. And in addition, there are a number of India-specific challenges which have to be overcome for a smooth transition to the flexible electricity system required to integrate such a high share of renewable. One of those India-specific challenges is, for example, that India has a very high reliance on solar as a source of renewable energy, because solar energy is a huge and cost-effective resource in India. The country has about 250 to 300 sunny days a year. And solar tariffs have fallen so much that now solar is cost competitive with coal. However, as you know, solar energy can only be produced during the day. And that brings me to another very specific India challenge, which is the demand peak for electricity. The demand peak in India happens at night when everyone turns on their air conditioner. And bear in mind that India at this stage only 6% of Indian households, more or less, have an air conditioner in their homes. And this, with standards of living improving, is only set to increase as well. So the peak for demand of electricity at nighttime, when solar energy cannot be produced, is only going to increase massively. And therefore flexibility solutions are going to have to be found. And those include storage, for example, to make sure that the solar energy that is produced during the day can cater to the peak. I'll just say one additional India-specific challenge or reality is seasonal variability of wind and hydropower generation, because power generation from wind and hydropower in India depends heavily on the monsoon season, which typically lasts from July to September, when the wind output is much higher. And this leads to the need for seasonal flexibility during the winter when generation from wind and hydro is low. So I'll stop here. There are other context-specific reasons, but this is just to give you an idea of why flexibility requirements can be different depending on different locations.
Thanks. Ron, could you answer the question from Maria Ballesteros? What are some of the institutional capacity issues faced by your teams in engaging with developing countries, especially those with carbon-intensive power sector, and what motivates them to enhance action? Also, there was a question about implementation of blockchain in practice. How can this actually be mobilized as a solution, given it's such a critical part of the transition? Over to you, Ron.
Okay, happy to. So on the institutional capacity, yeah, it's certainly, there's a big challenge around the world, not just in developing countries, but in developed countries as well. Some of the biggest areas where capacity is lacking is sort of staffing in regulatory agencies and with system operators who only have a few staff kind of responsible for managing the whole system and maintaining reliability, and have little capacity for extended training and learning about advanced technologies and systems. So that's one, we really need to help build capacity and find ways to support and augment staff available with the regulators and with utilities and system operators, and build up really strong educational programs in local universities for the next generation of engineers and analysts. I think we also see in some developing countries, they may not have very deep university programs on power system engineering. And so there's a need for enhancing the educational programs and the research ability for piloting and testing of new technologies and models and tools in local universities. So the second part of that question was about motivating and encouraging change. I think a huge part of the answer there is making the economic case. You know, as Brent talked about at the end of his talk, I mean, it's going to be especially important now that we're all going to be looking at a big economic hit from the coronavirus and the need for economic revitalization. So I think helping countries understand the jobs that will be generated, the long-term investment in infrastructure that can come from investments in renewable energy and efficiency and storage and advanced technologies, and the fact that these are in fact lower cost solutions than continued investment in conventional technologies. But it's not just about economics. Reliability is of course still a primary driver for power system regulators and operators. And so we have to continue to help people understand, as Naomi and Brent talked about, and I mentioned as well how to manage the role for managing variable renewables on the grid, and how in fact a diverse grid will actually improve reliability and performance as well as low cost. And finally, on motivation, learning from peers is so important. And that's one of the reasons we've launched this power consortium, so that at the CEO and at the staff level, we can bring together system operators that are successful with very high amounts of renewables on the system with others, to learn from each other and inspire confidence and motivation.
Thanks. Just following up on the finance issue, Sivaram has a question, and any of the panelists can go a little further in how to attract investment. All of what we're talking about requires heavy investment, and the investment would not flow until the policy landscape and payments are clear. How can we debottleneck and make investments flow, especially in markets where generation is mostly coal from subcritical fleet? Brent, do you want to see if you can take that one?
Sure, happy to say a few words if others want to add to it. Absolutely, this is a very important question. As an agency, we continue to do more work on this particular question of how to actually just accelerate that investment itself. As I mentioned, and one of the key points we go to policymakers with is the importance of giving long-term certainty, long-term commitment, so that if you develop the capabilities of producing and the capabilities of actually building these projects, that they know that the market and the demand will be there for that, and de-risking. So that's part of an overall package of de-risking the investment to the extent possible. This may be through, in many cases today, you have auction schemes that are providing a longer term contract for the power produced at least a minimum price, reducing some of the price risk in the long term, and that makes the projects more bankable. And in doing so, they can also achieve higher leveraging of debt, which is very cheap at the moment. So inevitably, this makes the cost of the projects lower to the community and back to the consumers at large. So it is a matter of managing all the steps, though there are many steps on the siting, permitting steps as well that need to be ironed out. Often the interest in developing these projects are there, but getting a viable pipeline of bankable projects is difficult. And so there are steps, very practical steps to be taken. I would encourage them to look, we have a World Energy Investment Report every year, highlight some of these issues, and there are many manuals about actually moving through this early investment stage to help a market become more mature. Okay, we're going to try to wrap up now. If anyone else has questions, comments on the finance, great. But I wanted to address the final questions. First from chat, Fidel Gisor, generation of renewable in some African countries is possible, but access to energy for people in the rural parts is the biggest problem. How do you plan to help countries to distribute energy to those in hard to reach areas? And then also folding in Kamal's question, do we need long-term low carbon development strategies for Africa? Is NDC implementation sufficient, as Africa is a minor contributor to global emissions? Naomi, do you want to take that? And then Brent, you could follow up.
Sure, I can try to take the first one. There are many reasons why countries push forward power transitions or transitions towards renewable energy, whether it's power grid or whether it's decentralized solutions. And I'll just say the prime reasons that a lot of countries are undertaking these transitions, and especially developing countries, is not always for climate considerations, but there are many other incentives that countries have to follow them, such as energy security, energy access, job creations, reduced air pollution, building resilience into the grids like Ron was talking about. And so in places where, for example, to address the question on, rural communities that don't access the grid, I was talking about this earlier in my presentation. Today, thanks to lower costs and technological advances, decentralized renewable energy generation has become a business model that is no longer just, in many localities, not just a one-off pilot project, but is becoming mainstream business models. And so the maturation of distributed renewable generation solution that can take the form, for example, of rooftop solar PV installations, mini and microgrids, community scale technologies, and other kinds. And the business models can involve, smart microgrids for accelerating energy access in remote part of the world with internal power flows, or also models where owners of rooftop solar panels that are connected to the grid can generate excess solar electricity during the day, which is fed back to the grid. So all of these are models that are being scaled with the involvement of the private sector. They're no longer, like I was saying, one-off projects that can't sustain themselves. And they are, sort of lowering the costs and making these options more accessible and more available to rural communities.
Any follow-up on the first question on low carbon development strategies for Africa? Also, Daya's question, how can we start implementing the low carbon development strategies for the energy sector? What are the first steps? Brent, could you address those?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are, I think Africa is increasingly critical to the global energy landscape. It was actually our regional focus in the World Energy Outlook 2019. And in fact, there's an Africa Energy Outlook that's available for download, covering many of these questions. Particularly, I would echo Naomi's point, particularly on the technology side, for providing access that renewable energy is the most cost-effective way to provide access to energy, and first access not only to electricity, but then also to modern clean cooking facilities. And to the question of Africa's role in the overall clean energy transitions, we see, given its small amount of emissions today, I think there should be less emphasis on a particular kind of growth for Africa, but there is a huge opportunity for Africa to develop economically and in energy terms in a different way, because these technologies are here, are available, are cost effective. And so it is about enabling the pathway forward and actually accelerating that deployment in Africa in a way that for their own interests, both financial and environmental, because also not only do we have, of course, CO2 related carbon emission reductions that are of interest, but also there's often a synergy with reducing pollution, local air pollution, where the same renewable energy technologies are, of course, tackling the same issue. So for their own interests, that then it is consistent with an overall clean energy track for the world.
Okay, final questions to wrap up here. One more question. As the new technologies are emerging for coal-fired plants, I guess he's talking about CCS, is that less polluting than other diesel and gas power plants? What is your opinion? Do any of our panelists have an opinion on that? And then finally, the question about the underlying assumption is electricity will be zero carbon. What is let me back up here. Energy sector is considered one of the doable challenges of decarbonizing, and a lot of industrial sector are betting large on switching to electricity and natural gas and later to hydrogen. The underlying assumption being that electricity will be zero carbon. What is the uncertainty of achieving zero carbon power across globe or in India by 2040 and 2050? Brent, maybe you could do you have any?
Sure. I think to have a shorter answer on the technology side, to date, coal-fired power plants, the most modern designs, the most efficient designs are still producing more CO2 emissions, particularly than gas-fired power plants, are also, even with filters, even with modern filters, are producing more local air pollution concerns as well. Diesel generators would probably be the worst amongst these options, but often they're much smaller. So you might think the amount of pollution produced there is relatively small, but that's just a matter of scale. On the uncertainty around decarbonizing electricity, I think through our scenarios we do highlight that this is not a preordained destination that you'll have fully decarbonized electricity by 2040 or 2050. This will take continued focus from policymakers to enable that pathway. What we see, again, is that we may meet most or all of new electricity demand with renewables, but if we don't take concerted action, the legacy emissions from coal-fired power plants, also from gas-fired power plants, and oil in some regions are far less likely to decline at any kind of rate compatible with an overall climate objective. So we do think that we continue to press policymakers to accelerate ambitions, to lift ambitions, taking advantage of the technologies that are there and ready today.
Okay, any final comments from Ron or Naomi?
I might add on the decarbonization question. I think as Brent and Naomi have highlighted, I think we absolutely have to move as quickly as possible as we can to moving towards a lower carbon electricity system, but it's not realistic that we're going to get to a completely decarbonized electricity system. You can in some cases get very high amounts of renewable energy as in your generation mix, but you can't over a yearly basis have 100% renewable energy generation in most electricity systems. So we need to plan for that, the fact that there are going to be some continuing emissions from coal and from gas. We need to look at the role of CCUS as an extra contributor in terms of reducing emissions, and also enable the transition as quickly as possible, while we're also electrifying end-use sectors, electrifying transport, electrifying buildings, and an industry, and have a kind of comprehensive pathway that scales up renewables, scales up demand management, scales up storage, with a bridge role for gas and consideration of CCUS and other carbon dioxide removal strategies.
Great. All right, we'll wrap up here. Please look out for the recording of this video. You can share with anyone who might be interested. That'll be coming within the next day. Our next webinar is on short-lived climate pollutants. And then we also have one on agriculture and food coming up. You can register at the URL that you see there, or you can just go to the WRI site to the events section, and you'll see all of our offerings for the next couple months. So stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again.